5 days. That was the distance between Sandra Bullock's greatest triumph and the scandal that turned it into her worst nightmare.
Worked with you. I've tried to kiss you successfully and unsuccessfully.
Even though Ryan was only 21 years old and Sandra was much older, they started dating for 2 years.
You get the call that morning from Sandy's publicist.
I made mistakes and did stuff that I shouldn't have. I handled the situation not the way I should have.
He has evolved on a level that is not human. I found the love of my life.
My mom said, I'm gonna raise you so you don't need anyone else but yourself.
Just days after holding an Oscar in front of the world, she found herself at the center of a betrayal that destroyed her marriage and stunned Hollywood.
Did I really earn this, or did I just wear you all down? I would like to thank the Academy for allowing me in the last month to have the most incredible ride with rooms full of artists that I see tonight and that I've worked with before and I hope to work with in the future.
So what really happened behind Sandra Bullock and Jesse James's shocking split? And why did it unfold at the very moment she should have been celebrating? Join us as we uncover the full story of why Sandra Bullock left Jesse James. The 5 days that changed everything. On March 7th, 2010, Sandra Bullock walked the red carpet at the Academy Awards with her husband of 5 years standing beside her. Hours later, she won the Oscar for Best Actress for her role in The Blind Side. It was the kind of moment that defines a career, the highest possible recognition in her profession, arriving at what looked, from the outside, like the peak of both her professional and personal life. Just days after that Oscar win, an American tabloid published an interview with a woman claiming to have carried out an affair with Jesse James, while Sandra had been away filming The Blind Side in Atlanta. The timing was almost impossible to process. The same week the world was celebrating Sandra's greatest professional achievement, the foundation of her personal life was being exposed as something far less stable than anyone watching from the outside had assumed. Sandra pulled out of the London premiere of The Blind Side as the story unfolded, the first visible sign that something had genuinely broken behind the scenes. She filed for divorce in April 2010, just weeks after the allegations surfaced. The divorce was finalized in June 2010, with the official filing citing discord or conflict of personalities as the legal grounds for the split, a standard, sanitized legal phrase that gave no public indication of the much rawer truth everyone already suspected. The terms of the settlement itself were sealed by the court, meaning the public never received an official accounting of how the marriage's assets, property, or remaining obligations were divided. What the public did receive, almost immediately, and without any need for court documents, was confirmation of exactly what had caused the marriage to end. Jesse James did not deny it for long. He gave a tearful interview on ABC's Nightline in May 2010, admitting directly that he had taken a pretty amazing life and marriage and thrown it away.
The headlines say that you're most hated man in America.
I think it's the most hated man in the world now. I took a pretty amazing life and amazing success and marriage and everything and kind of, threw it away by my own hand, so.
It was a public confession from a man who had built his entire television career, hosting Monster Garage and running the custom motorcycle shop West Coast Choppers, around a rugged, no-nonsense image. That same man was now sitting in front of cameras admitting, in real time, that he had destroyed something genuinely valuable through his own choices. Years later, speaking to The Daily Beast, Jesse described his own thinking at the time with more nuance, saying he believed several factors had been at play: ego, loneliness, distrust, which probably led to resentment. He also told the Daily Mail directly in 2017, in the clearest and most unambiguous confirmation he ever gave. "Yeah, I did cheat on my wife. Yeah."
Well, Sandy, I cheated on her. I admitted it. The media blew it away. I think take the blame. Everybody just denies everything, and I did. I stood up and took the blame. All that did is pour gasoline on it and assume that everything was worse.
I stood up and took accountability for it and apologized. And that's end of story. That admission, repeated across multiple interviews over multiple years, removed any ambiguity about what had actually happened inside the marriage. This was not a case of a celebrity divorce shrouded in mystery, where neither side ever clarified what went wrong. Jesse confirmed, on the record, in his own words, that infidelity was the cause. In a particularly raw interview with in-depth host Graham Bensinger, Jesse described the period surrounding the scandal as the time he learned what it was like to lose everything. He said, "I made mistakes and did stuff that I shouldn't have. I handled the situation not the way that I should have." But what makes James's account genuinely revealing is not simply the confession itself. It is what he said the affair actually cost him, beyond the obvious loss of his marriage and his public reputation. Because hidden inside the wreckage of that scandal was something that James has described, repeatedly and with visible pain, as the single hardest consequence of everything he did. So what exactly did Jesse James lose that he has never fully recovered from? The son he lost in 24 hours. Before the scandal broke, Sandra Bullock and Jesse James had been working through the long, careful process of adopting a child together. The adoption process had actually begun 4 years before the scandal, in New Orleans, Louisiana. The boy, who would become known as Louis, began living with Sandra and James as a couple in January 2010, just 2 months before the Oscars. For a brief window, the family that Sandra and Jesse had been hoping to build together was finally, actually coming together. Jesse himself described this period with a kind of painful tenderness in his interview with Bensinger. He said that as bad as things had been between him and Sandra before the scandal, they had adopted a kid, and things got kind of good for a little while, and they had that kid to focus on. And then, in his words, boom, it was over in 24 hours. Gone. Done. The infidelity did not only end a marriage between two adults who had decided their relationship no longer worked, it detonated a family that had just finally begun to feel whole. Because the adoption process had technically been Sandra's to complete as a single parent, given the timing of everything, the divorce meant that custody of Louis went to her. James has spoken about the loss of access to Louis as the single most painful consequence of his own actions. He said, "I got divorced and lost a kid I adopted because of it. Whether that's fair, whether I should have lost a kid due to infidelity, which I don't think anybody ever does. But I think with Hollywood law, that's totally fair." He went further in that same interview, asking rhetorically how he could have expected to make himself a better person and be expected to be a husband and make the right decisions when he was constantly surrounded by what he described as that negative influence, an apparent reference to the environment and choices that had contributed to the affair in the first place. He concluded, with blunt self-criticism, that he should have just left the marriage rather than betraying it. While James was processing his own role in the collapse of the marriage through interview after interview, Sandra Bullock was going through something entirely different. The project of rebuilding an actual life and an actual family in the immediate aftermath, largely outside the glare of the same media cycle that had documented her husband's confessions in such painstaking detail. What did Sandra's own version of moving forward actually look like? And what has she said, in her own words, about what the divorce ultimately taught her? Sandra's process of starting over. Sandra Bullock has never given the kind of tell-all, blow-by-blow account of the affair and divorce that Jesse eventually provided across multiple interviews. Her public reflections have instead focused, consistently and deliberately, on what came after, on the work of rebuilding a life and a family once the marriage itself was over. Speaking to The Independent years later, Sandra reflected directly on the period, saying, "My life took a trajectory that wasn't very pleasant, but I feel like it had to happen in order for me to fully understand what family was about." The marriage she had built with James and the version of family she had imagined alongside him turned out not to be the version that would define the rest of her adult life. What replaced it was something she built largely on her own. Before the affair became public, Sandra and Jesse had been jointly investigating the possibility of adopting children together. After the divorce, Sandra continued that adoption process entirely on her own, announcing the formal adoption of Louis in May 2010, just weeks after the divorce proceedings concluded. In 2013, she expanded her family further, adopting a daughter named Layla. What Sandra has described about navigating single motherhood in the years that followed reveals just how much cultural pressure she had to push through, separate entirely from the pain of the divorce itself. She told The Independent honestly, "Society still, as open-minded as we've become, has these rules that quietly say, 'This is the way it goes.' They're saying it's a man and a woman, and then you have a baby, and that's the family." I go, "Oh my God, I'm a single parent with a child. How am I?" I felt less than. I felt I'm not the complete package. That admission, the feeling of being less than, of not being the complete package, captures something that rarely gets discussed honestly in coverage of celebrity divorces. The public narrative tends to focus on scandal, blame, and the eventual moving on. What Sandra revealed was the much quieter, more internal struggle that followed, the work of unlearning a cultural script about what a family was supposed to look like, simply because the family she had actually built no longer matched that script. But she did not stay stuck in that feeling. She told The Independent that she eventually arrived at a different understanding entirely. And then I realized, this is the complete package. That shift from feeling incomplete to recognizing the family she had built as whole and sufficient exactly as it was, is arguably the closest thing to a direct answer Sandra has ever given about why the divorce happened and what it ultimately meant for her life. The marriage to James had not produced the family she imagined. The family she actually built, as a single mother raising Louis and later Layla on her own, became something she came to recognize as genuinely complete in its own right. She has also spoken about how that experience shaped her relationship with fear as a parent. Discussing her son Louis visiting her on the set of the Netflix thriller Bird Box, where every cast member was asked to describe their character's greatest fear, Bullock said her own answer was something happening to her children. She admitted, "I live in such a fearful place. I'm so afraid all the time. I think becoming a mother has made me that much more fearful." That admission reveals how deeply the experience of building her family alone, after the very public collapse of her marriage, reshaped her emotional life going forward. Bullock's path after the divorce eventually led her toward another significant relationship, one that would carry its own profound and devastating loss years later. So what happened to the life Sandra Bullock built after James? And how did love and grief intertwine again in the years that followed? The love she found and the loss that followed. After the divorce from James, Sandra Bullock eventually entered into a relationship with photographer Brian Randall. The two were together for 8 years. Randall became a significant and stabilizing presence in the lives of both Louis and Layla, the children Bullock had raised as a single mother in the years immediately following the James divorce. That relationship ended through devastating loss. Brian died from ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, in August 2023. Sandra has continued raising Louis and Layla as a single mother in the years since Brian's passing, meaning she has now navigated two profoundly different but equally significant losses across her adult life. The public collapse of a marriage through infidelity, followed years later by the quiet, private grief of losing a partner to a terminal illness. What is striking, looking at the full arc of Sandra's life since 2010, is how consistently she has approached both of these very different losses with the same underlying philosophy she described to The Independent.
I think also the question of what is a parent is really important to me, because we have a narrative that says, well, when a man and a woman get together and the sperm and the egg, all that stuff.
Yeah.
And then you have the rest of the world where there are adoptions and through foster care and all. My family, if it wasn't for adoption and foster care, I wouldn't have my family.
Yeah.
So
the belief that difficult, painful experiences ultimately serve a purpose in shaping a deeper understanding of what family and love actually require. The divorce from James forced her to redefine what a complete family looked like. The loss of Brian forced her to rebuild that definition again, on her own, while continuing to raise the same two children whose adoptions had originally been set in motion during her marriage to James. While Sandra was navigating these deeply personal chapters largely outside the spotlight, Jesse James's life took a considerably more public and chaotic turn, one that would eventually circle back, in painful and ironic ways, to the very same patterns that had ended his marriage to Bullock in the first place. What happened to Jesse James in the years after the divorce? And why did his story end up repeating itself in ways nobody expected? The pattern that repeated itself. In June 2022, Jesse James married Bonnie Rotten, whose real name is Elena Hicks, a former adult film actress. The couple welcomed a son named Bishop in June 2023. For a period, it appeared Jesse had found a stable second chapter in his personal life, more than a decade removed from the scandal that had ended his marriage to Sandra. That stability did not last. James and Bonnie filed for divorce twice in December 2022 alone, before reconciling and welcoming Bishop the following year. In November 2024, Bonnie filed for divorce a third time, this time accompanied by a request for a restraining order, citing physical violence and abuse. Jesse responded with his own counterpetition for divorce, along with his own request for a restraining order, alleging that Rotten had committed several incidents of abuse against him. The legal filing itself echoed almost word for word the language used in Sandra's original divorce filing 14 years earlier, citing discord or conflict of personalities between the parties that destroys the legitimate ends of the marriage relationship and prevents any reasonable expectation of reconciliation. The same sanitized legal phrasing that had once concealed the truth of Jesse's infidelity to Sandra was now being used again, in a relationship marked by very different but equally serious allegations. Despite the severity of the abuse claims on both sides, Jesse and Bonnie ultimately reconciled again. On January 6, 2025, the two jointly filed a notice of non-suit, formally dismissing the divorce case and closing it in court records. Social media activity around the same time suggested the reconciliation was genuine, including a post from Jesse captioned, "With characteristic bluntness, cheaper to keep her, but not by much." That reconciliation, however, proved temporary as well. Bonnie filed for divorce again in November 2024, the third filing in roughly 2 years of marriage. The pattern of filing, reconciling, and filing again has become a defining feature of James's second marriage, in a way that stands in stark contrast to the single, clean, final break that ended his marriage to Sandra back in 2010. There is something genuinely instructive in comparing these two very different post-divorce trajectories. Bullock's path after Jesse involved one painful public ending, followed by a deliberate and largely private process of rebuilding her family on entirely new terms, terms she eventually came to describe as complete in their own right. Jesse's path after Sandra involved a public reckoning with his own infidelity, followed years later by a second marriage marked by repeated cycles of conflict, separation, and reconciliation that, by his own account, echo some of the same destructive patterns he had once identified as contributing factors in the original scandal: ego, loneliness, distrust, and the resentment that follows from all three. Now, let's talk about the full story fans got from Sandra and Jesse's story. What the full story actually reveals. After observing everything that has actually been said by both Sandra Bullock and Jesse James across more than a decade of interviews following their divorce, a clearer picture emerges than the one the tabloids originally offered in 2010. The affair was real. James confirmed it, repeatedly and unambiguously, across multiple interviews spanning years. The legal filing that ended the marriage used the sanitized language of conflict of personalities, but everyone involved, including James himself, has long since dispensed with any pretense that the divorce was about anything other than his infidelity. What makes this story more twisted than a simple cheating scandal is what both parties have revealed about what the divorce actually cost them and what each of them built or failed to build in its aftermath. Jesse lost access to a son he had adopted and clearly loved, describing that specific loss, even years later, as the most painful and lasting consequence of his own choices. He has taken consistent public accountability for his actions, repeating versions of the same admission across nearly a decade and a half of interviews, even as his own subsequent marriage has fallen into strikingly similar patterns of conflict and instability. Sandra, for her part, has never centered her public reflections on blame or betrayal. She has instead focused, consistently, on the process of rebuilding, first as a single mother completing the adoption of Louis on her own, then expanding her family further with the adoption of Layla, then finding new love with Brian Randall, and then navigating profound grief again when ALS took him from her family in 2023. Her answer to why the divorce happened has never really been about Jesse James at all. It has been about what she learned, painfully and gradually, about what a family actually is, once the version she had originally imagined no longer existed. As she put it most directly to The Independent, "My life took a trajectory that wasn't very pleasant, but I feel like it had to happen in order for me to fully understand what family was about." That sentence is the closest thing to a final answer Sandra Bullock has ever given about her divorce from Jesse James. What do you think the full story reveals about how each of them actually processed what happened? And do you think James has truly broken the pattern or simply found himself living it again? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.